Good morning, good afternoon, good evening around the world. My name is Doug Brunke. I am the founder and CEO of Global Chamber. And as of about an hour ago, I am a new grandfather. So baby Luca was born in Palo Alto, California, and I've seen some pictures and he looks kind of ticked off at this point, that his kind of world was disturbed quite a bit. And I think that probably is a good segue into what we're talking about today. We're talking about the future, and when we think about it, it can tick us off because there's a lot going on that's kind of crazy. And then there's, of course, always technology evolving and market dynamics, and the whole world is changing, and we could decide to go out into the desert of Arizona and live in a mobile park and wrap ourselves in aluminum foil and try and insulate ourselves from all of that. But I know the global tribe is not like that. We embrace the future, we embrace other people, we embrace what those opportunities bring. And so what we thought we'd do is we talk to an expert on the future, somebody who has their finger on the button of what's going to be happening going forward, has been for quite a while. Mike Moran of Microshare is that person. He's got about a half-hour presentation, and then we're going to open it up for questions. Mike and Microshare, they do a lot of work in the workspace area. They were very busy during COVID as the dynamics of that situation changed. And just overall, they've had a really great view of what's coming and been able to anticipate that with new technologies for the workplace. And so, Mike, thank you so much for taking the time to share more about what your view and vision is of the future. We look forward to hearing what that is and then having a conversation afterwards.
Yes, and it's the conversation I look forward to as well. I'm going to take folks through a quick slideshow, and I hope in the beginning to give you a sense of my experience that gives me this perch. And I'm very, very honored to be doing this for the Global Chamber. So with just a second, if you give me just a moment, I will share my screen and start at the beginning. That's always a good place to start. So hold on, slideshow, play from the start. Here we go. So as Doug said, we're gonna do a kind of tour de planet, and to start out look at what we believe at Microshare and what I've come to understand as the kind of near horizon. 2 years is a long way right now, particularly in American politics, obviously, because in between today and 2025, there will be a presidential election and in a very divisive atmosphere. I don't want to get overly political in this, but it is an input, to use the term that economists love, and we can't ignore it. So very quickly on who I am and why I can do this stuff. We came out, I'm the chief marketing officer and sustainability and risk officer at Microshare, which is a smart building technology company. I am an author and a documentarian, spent years running editorial at the Council on Foreign Relations, worked on Wall Street in the City of London for a while as an analyst and researcher, did a lot of documentary work, and I came out of the world of journalism. I was a foreign correspondent, covered wars and revolutions, and was at Radio Free Europe many years ago when the wall came down. So I've seen my share of global events changing the way we work and live and think about the world. So a little bit about me. I've written a couple of books. I'm often on television, done a bunch of documentaries, won some Emmys, and I have a lecture every 2 semesters or so. I lecture in political risk at Corbell over at the University of Denver here in Denver. I'm based in Denver. So let's start with the workplace. And as I said, this might seem a little breathless, but we're going to try to cover a lot here. The other long COVID is what I'm calling it. The workplace dynamic is different today than it was going into the pandemic. And it's not just for epidemiological reasons. Obviously, we saw the sudden realization that indoor spaces are not just inert, invisible air, but things that you could literally die from. the health um, and wellness of the people inside indoor spaces is something that came into strong focus during the pandemic. It has had an enormous effect on people's sense of well-being, their willingness to invest in a career that means sitting in a indoor space for most of your day. So in many ways, this is the office culture we're talking about here, but it's also factories and retail and anywhere where you're in a confined area for your 8 to 10 to 12-hour shift. I don't know that anybody's working 12-hour shifts like me anymore. I'm sure there are people, but that old kind of Mad Men culture of the office, I think, is dying. And in many ways, COVID was the coup de grace. It's not going to change completely. There will be companies that insist on a, time card approach to, and frankly, almost Big Brother approach to, productivity measurement, and the workplace culture will survive for a while. But I think we're seeing that the generation that has taken over the workforce as the majority now, which is the millennials and people born before them, it's no longer the boomers as the majority. They are saying no to this, and they want some of the changes that were forced by COVID to persist beyond it. In that way, you're going to see, and this is where Microshare has been very involved, technological changes in the workplace where data generated in many cases by Internet of Things sensors will measure things like air quality and humidity and CO2 saturation. We'll be able to tell people in an office which conference rooms are open, but also importantly, which were cleaned and when were they cleaned. These are things that people really took for granted, didn't care much about before, but they care a lot now. And so all sorts of new technologies have entered the office. That's both a good thing and potentially a source of ill will by the workforce, because anytime they see something on the wall, they assume it's a camera. Most of the time it isn't. We don't use cameras. We think that's a privacy violation and ultimately regulatory problem, but it's going to happen. You're going to see a lot of new opportunities with technology to change the nature of the workplace, to try to make people want to come back to work. So you also saw during the pandemic the enormous collapse of global supply chains, and these kind of changes intersected with ongoing trends that were already predating the pandemic. So a kind of protectionist vein had come into global economics. Nativism is a nice word for people who don't want to allow any foreigners in their country. But ultimately, these types of things were supercharged by COVID. And of course, some infrastructure is now in place, which I think, I use the analogy with 9/11, our experience of getting on an aircraft changed forever in 9/11. Some of it has diminished and it's gotten a little more systematic. It's not as drastic, but it's never going to be the same. You're never going to walk your wife to the gate, give her a kiss, or go onto the plane, God forbid, if she forgot something. Those days are gone. Similarly, the office is going to be different. The worker employer relationship is very different. This is subject to debate. Will a tightened economy change that and force workers to bend a little more? Well, people have been predicting that for 2 years and it hasn't happened. I think the workforce feels like they have some changes, have some new leverage on employers. And it's not just because of COVID, it's because it's a generational shift and because the big baby boom workforce is gone. They're retiring. So you're getting a tighter workforce in terms of numbers as well. So that's workforce. And I know there'll be a lot of questions, but I was hoping we can hold those for the end. And I'm going to take you through a couple of other things that I think are important trends that are very much in the world right now. So right now you're seeing a lot of attention on climate and sustainability. This is another thing that was very much, supercharged by COVID. ESG is the environmental social governance is really an investment strategy. It has now become a movement per se, and it is such a large and well-established movement now that it has predictably sparked the the backlash, which is I'm titling "The Empire Strikes Back." ESG is having a bit of a reckoning right now because there was, as with everything, there's always assumption that you can look backwards and predict the future by imagining what happened in the past. Well, COVID was totally unpredictable, and ultimately, the kind of smooth transition away from fossil fuels that people thought might happen has been upset by a lot of things. One of them, of course, is COVID and supply chain issues. The second, though, and perhaps even more surprising, is the sudden war in Ukraine and the use of, I guess, in some ways, you got to wonder if you feel sorry for Germany, or you think they kind of get what they deserve by risking their energy future on Russia. One way or another, though, it's a pretty powerful weapon the Russians have in their hands to cause mischief in Europe and to cause energy prices around the world to spike. So those are the kinds of disruptive things that have suddenly been thrown at this climate and sustainability movement, which was chugging right along before COVID. And even during COVID, the Ukraine war was a huge comeuppance. Now, what will happen? I don't think, and God bless everybody in Florida, climate risk is real. I mean, there is no doubt. And if you don't want to talk about it in political terms, just go talk to somebody in the insurance industry and watch what they're doing to coastal cities. Look at the tax rises that are being put in place to fund things like hardening of seawalls or drainage systems. And look at the American Southwest. I live in Colorado. I feel a little bit smug, but we had to cut off a lot of the water that we're sending to Nevada, and to Nevada and Arizona. The Colorado River is the main vein here for water, and it's running dry. I tell you, we didn't get a lot of rain here this year, as you know, and the snowpack has been less and less recent years. So, these are real issues. They're not going away just because Vladimir Putin decided to expand the borders of his country. But there is a fierce debate going on. The empire, in this case, I think, are the people who don't like the idea that anything other than shareholder value would be figured into the value of a company or as a mission of a company. That is a losing battle, but they're going to fight it until to the last man, I think. Moving on, and we're going to take questions, as I said. Moving on from this, geoeconomics. So globalization has hit the wall. We know that. We've seen that in political trends in the United States. It was really a long overdue reckoning for the impact on middle and lower middle class workforces to offshore so much of the production of things. That eventually did kind of snap back at politics. And now you can't find a free trader in either party in the United States, and it's hard to find one overseas either, unless you're talking about China or India, where the benefits are obvious. So you're seeing this kind of return, and pandemic again accelerated this, to supply chains that are closer. So Mexico should really benefit from this. Canada should really benefit for this, and supply chains that are actually within the national borders. So we're seeing, reshoring, so to speak, something they've been talking about for years, but never really happened until the pandemic, particularly of strategic things like energy and food of certain types. And then, the great example was the masks, all of which were pretty much made in China before the pandemic. But now you're seeing it with defense as well. You're going to see, I predicted this years ago, there's a group called CFIUS, which is the Treasury Department entity that kind of judges whether or not an attempt to buy a company by a foreign power is going to go through. That's become so politicized now. China was buying some big American technology firms, and up until about 7 years ago, it became harder. There's still efforts to do it, but that's pretty much being shut down now. And you're seeing a decoupling, not only in technology with these tariffs and political barriers, but also in markets. The New York Stock Exchange is pretty much ejecting Chinese firms because they don't have enough transparency for the market to feel comfortable having their investors, put money into these companies. So there's a lot of decoupling going on. Another driver of inflation right now, all of these things, by the way, obviously drive inflation. Another one is, what I call greenflation, which is essentially, look, I don't know how you come down on moving away from fossil fuels, but it's not going to be cheap. It's not just going to happen because we want it to. It's going to be expensive. And if you want to think about why, just think about how hard it is to put charging stations around the country to support electric vehicles. It's just one tiny question of this. It's going to be expensive to move from one to the other, and it's not going to happen quickly, and technological breakthroughs are still needed. So there is a lose-lose scenario here, whereas everybody goes back to the 1920s and 30s, where tariffs were just unbelievably high, and international trade kind of froze. A lot of that driven by empires. The French Empire traded within the empire. The British Empire traded within the empire. I mean, we could see a kind of dual world where, the Chinese-Russian bloc trade within its bloc, just like the Soviet bloc did years ago. I hope we don't get there. That's the lose-lose scenario, because it also creates the disincentives to get along and solve problems without war. So speaking of war, we've seen enormous changes since I'd say the last kind of moment of reckoning was in the 2008 financial crisis. For all the dysfunction there, much of it inside U.S. markets, the world kind of came together and figured out, all right, we have to tackle this together. There was a G20, remember that group meeting, and the big two were the U.S. and China, and their central banks coordinated, and they tackled it. And, it wasn't exactly a soft landing, but it wasn't the Great Depression. And that was really possible at that moment. We're not seeing that kind of cooperation on anything these days. You saw what happened in Taiwan when Nancy Pelosi went there, questionable whether she should have done it. But one way or another, the fact is China is showing its ability and its willingness to go to the floor, go to the mat on Taiwan in a way that wasn't true before. And the US is talking tough on Taiwan in a way that wasn't true before. That's a huge problem for the world. There's no such thing as a limited US-China war. That's a disaster for the globe. You're seeing now also that the countries that have kind of not adapted well to the modern world are having a moment mostly because of energy prices. But I think these are very short-lived moments. Russia is a failed state. There's no other way to put it. I've spent a good deal of my life studying, working on, and working around Russia. It is out of control. And the Chinese are now backing away, which is a good sign. They recklessly encouraged what the Russians did, and the Russians are showing that, they're a paper tiger at the moment. Obviously, they are a paper tiger with a lot of nuclear weapons, unfortunately. It's a scary situation, but I think they are slowly losing that war, and that's a good thing for the world. Saudi and Iran, you saw just this week, since I made this deck, Iran has exploded again in anger, mostly over the way they treat women, but it's channeling a lot of dissent. It's a very young country, and so does Saudi Arabia, and there's not enough jobs to go around. The Saudis, obviously are in the catbird seat at the moment, but things go up and down in the oil markets, and Saudi is kind of painfully aware that the region around them is changing, and that their old United States protectors are kind of changing their attitude towards Saudi as well. So you're seeing the same thing with Latin American dictatorships. Cuba is really also ran at this point. Nobody except outside of Miami is paying a lot of attention to what goes on in Cuba. Venezuela is a Cuba in the making. You're seeing a real dysfunction in Brazil now, mostly due to the fact that Bolsonaro is a dictatorial leader and kind of eroding democratic norms there. That has hurt their economy and their reputation around the world. The Western blowhards or the Western blowhards, I told you we're not going to get politics, but imagine who I'm talking about. And then, Europe has had a wake-up call. For years, they basically freeloaded off the United States defense budget. They made enormous mistakes. I've written a yearly column over the last 10 years warning the Germans that they were making a huge mistake. in allowing this pipeline to become their main source of energy. And it's, I don't feel good that it came true, but sometimes when it comes true, there's a thing called moral hazard in Wall Street, meaning, you should have something on the line when you make an investment. Well, they had a lot on the line and they screwed it up. And it's causing trouble across the world and across Europe. Finally, a really quick line on India, Brazil, and the rise of the rest. One of the most interesting things about the Ukraine war is the way that the U.S. Has squandered its ability to create coalitions globally. I think this has a lot to do with the Iraq war. There's a credibility problem with the U.S. now that means that the Brazilians and the Indians and the Indonesians and other kind of medium-sized important powers have no intention of being kind of, stampeded into some anti-Russia coalition. They're going to sit on the fence and they're going to do what is good for them. That might make sense from a nationalist standpoint. Americans don't like to be told they have to do something for the sake of the world, but for the sake of the world is not such a good thing. It would have been nice if a genuine embargo could have been created with some of these other larger powers. The fact is, Russia has found it very easy to sell its oil to China and India, replacing their markets in Europe. So that kind of ability to kind of convene a global movement is a victim of the really tremendously reckless Iraq war, which really hurt American credibility, as did the 2008 crisis. So we've lost that kind of mojo we had coming into the 21st century. Doesn't mean you can't regain it, and certainly Putin's doing everything he can to make us look good right now. But that is a shame. So really quickly, little humility here. I saw on Saturday Night Live, an old Saturday Night Live, they did this thing in Jeopardy 1999, and it is hilarious to think of what they thought 1999 would look like back in 1978. And so that reminds me to always have a little humility. How do I know this? The reality is we don't know what's going to happen. It's important that I admit that. Also, it's important that you have logical scenarios in mind. So what I'm saying here is the things I think are most likely, but there's definitely alternatives and outlier scenarios. And I'll give you an example. When I was a partner at Control Risk, it was my job to predict elections. This is hard for me to look at. But the reality is, most people thought this was the scenario, right? But if you look over on the right, you'll see credible, alternative, and outlier. And I'm very proud of what those slides say, because that's us preparing our clients for the possibility that Donald Trump would win. We're not discounting it. We were just saying it was less likely than what our most likely scenario was. Well, I was wrong, but the credible alternative is always worth keeping in mind. And there's a lot of alternative scenarios in everything I just presented. So with that, I want to stop talking and give folks an opportunity to ask questions.
That is a lot to digest. And you said you were going to take about 25 minutes, and you took exactly 25 minutes. So amazing. I see Bill Edwards in the audience, and I don't know, Bill, if you can speak right now, but when I think about people who also have their finger on the future, you are definitely one of them. I'm wondering, what you've just heard. I'll bet you have some comments and maybe some questions as well.
Well, I really appreciate Michael's insight and his background. The key to doing international business is getting as much information as you can from people who have actually done something other than just fly in and stay in places overnight at a hotel. I've been doing business for 40 years in China, as you know, Doug, and I lived there several years. And I'm always amazed at China consultants who have spent 3 nights in Shanghai and then put China consultant next to their name. So Michael has got that credibility. With 4+ decades of doing this all over the world, I find myself in a position where I'm not really sure what's going to happen, Michael, Doug. It's difficult to predict. COVID, we didn't predict, and of course we worked through that, and then all of a sudden this, I can't use the word, from Russia comes along, and does another black swan on us, which has immense implications, not just for poor Ukraine, but all of the European Union, the UK, most of the Middle East and Near East, where the grain from Ukraine and Russia goes to feed poor people that don't have a lot. And then, of course, we have our friends, quote unquote, out in China, who are focused on the third term for Winnie the Pooh, and wondering what's going to happen. Is he ever going to bring his country back out of zero COVID? I haven't been there in over 3 years because of COVID. We still have an office in Beijing and a poor managing director who's got nothing to do because we take brands into China, U.S. brands primarily. I'm just at a quandary as to figuring out what's going to happen next. I do want to make one comment, Michael, and that is how important, and don't take this the wrong way, or an indication of my feeling, but how important is ESG in the world with all the parameters and things we have going on that I unfortunately was able to list to you right now?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's what's being hashed out right now. And I think ESG, for those who are unfamiliar, is basically the idea that companies should exist for something other than making money, right? That part of the kind of quid pro quo of allowing you to list on the stock exchange or raise money in the United States economy is that you're going to be a responsible corporate citizen. ESG takes that to the next level and tries to project the environmental and social cost that the company is imposing on society, or what benefits it's producing. So the theory behind the investment scheme is that ESG companies that rate well on various ESG metrics, whether it's carbon footprint or how they treat their workforce or their communities, will be more resilient in a downturn, and over time will perform better economically than their non-highly rated rivals. That is coming up for a reckoning right now because the energy prices have supercharged the firms that are precisely not well rated in ESG terms. So I think over the long term, you used the right term. This is a black swan. There's always going to be black swans that will interrupt any theory. But I think over the long term, and in some of the previous downturns, ESG rated companies have proven to be more resilient, stock share price, and in market penetration, growth, et cetera. I do think, though, this is the moment where that theory is really it's a crucible. Coming out of this, if ESG companies don't stabilize faster and then pick up and grow more quickly, then that's going to cause some real problems. The other side of it, though, is the government is now getting involved. It's a political issue. People who are kind of market purists, I call them the kind of Chicago boys or the Friedman crowd, they don't want this. This is a non-issue for corporate performance as far as they're concerned. Others, though, and it's not always Republicans versus Democrats, but it does tend to break down that way. Others want to see this kind of regulated and enforced, that good corporate behavior should be something that you have to report to the SEC on. And they're working on rules right now for that. It's already in place in Europe. Europe, in a lot of ways, is the canary in the coal mine for any regulatory issue these days. It almost always comes back here. And the point of contagion is California. California almost immediately looks at a European regulation and says, that's a great idea, let's do it. And if California does it, and you're a company that sells into the US market, you pretty much have to do it. So those are the kind of issues that are going around. But I do think there's some question about it. I personally think over time, it will be important, if only because the generation that's taken over the world wants it to be important. That's a long answer, sorry.
Oh, there's a lot to unpack there and a lot of follow-up questions, kind of building on what Bill asked and where he was headed with China. And in the comments there, one of the speakers we had recently at Global Chamber talked about China in the sense that there's an unwritten understanding between the people and the government that as long as the economics work, as long as the economy continues to grow, then they'll allow the leaders to continue. That is threatened by the COVID approach that you talked about. Are we headed toward, or could we be headed toward some sort of a regime change in China because of their COVID policy?
Well, so I'll sign up for the guy who spent time in Beijing and Shanghai hotels and Hong Kong. So I'm gonna say at that as a caveat. But at control risk, we have a very, when I was there in the middle of the last decade, we had a very strong China practice, and we used to say China at 7% will raise the world's economic growth. China at 4% is in revolution. China is now growing at below 4%. Now, how do you prevent people from showing displeasure? You have a state of emergency. That's the magic bullet of every dictatorship, and it's a plague book that's been well used across history, including in the United States. I don't know if you've ever watched FDR's original inauguration speech. It's beautiful. We'd have nothing to fear but fear itself. But at some point in there, he says, and if that doesn't work in the first 100 days, I will ask for the powers that I would get in executive powers as if we were invaded by a foreign country. So the state of emergency was actually in play there. It scared the hell out of Republicans. So it never actually happened, but there are a lot of people who don't like FDR, and they look at him as a guy who used executive power in an overreaching way. So in China, to get back to that, I think Xi Jinping is very concerned about that issue, and this has happened precisely when he has to overturn the rules that say that informal rules that say only 2 terms for a Chinese leader. He's probably going to overturn that. I think he's got everyone running scared, everybody in power. And the Chinese, unlike the Russians, you got to give the Russians credit. They overthrew the Soviet Union. If you look at the constituent parts, there were a lot of revolutions that happened. They weren't tremendously bloody, but some of them were pretty bloody, and they overthrew that regime at the end of the day. The Russian regime itself kind of imploded, but all the Ukrainians, the Kazakhs, the Kyrgyz, all these at the Balts, they had revolution. There's no history of that in China. You have to go back to 1911 really to see that. There was a civil war, obviously, in the middle of the last century, but China is a tough thing to predict when it comes to overthrowing. The Chinese Communist Party is a pretty powerful thing. I never say never. I'd say it's an outlier scenario, to use my terminology. I think he'll muddle through, but I do think there's going to be some problems created by the low growth they're having. And that's not just generated by COVID. That's also generated by a collapse of demographics that you can trace right back to the ridiculous one-child policy. Their workforce is shrinking. People don't realize that. And I know the China hands here know that's very well. And it's also an unbalanced population with lots of men, because when they went to a one-child policy, there were selective abortions because traditional societies favored the male. And so they've got a lot of angry young men without jobs, potentially. And that does cause a lot of trouble. If you've ever been to Hoboken on a Saturday night, that's pretty much what that is. Angry young men with nothing to do. That's just trouble.
I did not know that. I thought where you were headed there, and I guess you were, was that what they'll end up doing is using Taiwan as that emergency power. Is that where you were alluding to? Is that one of the likely scenarios?
It's a good, dictators always have war as a safety, but it's a temporary fix. And I think I really don't think they're going to do that. I've been wrong in the past, as I showed. I think that is a really huge mistake for China because they are so intertwined with the global economy. I think they're looking very carefully at what's happened to Russia as a result of Ukraine. It's a great war game for Taiwan. How would the West react if we did this? How painful would it be? That they must be feeling pretty good, frankly, because the Russians, while it's hurting them, most of the errors and the pain that's being inflicted on Russia is being inflicted by Russia, not by the West. So I think the Chinese are probably taking the lesson that if we were to do something in Taiwan, we could survive it. But the question is also, can you then, face the world? Can you be the rising power, displacing the US in terms of global leadership? And that is their ultimate goal, not merely grabbing Taiwan, because, grabbing Taiwan means pretty much destroying much of what of value there. So you end up with what the Russians end up in Crimea, a big ward of the state. So I don't think they'll do it. And I'd love to hear others' opinions.
Okay. So when you were referring to using emergency powers, perhaps it was about COVID then, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's it. He's keeping a state of emergency in play because it's a very convenient thing.
I see. Okay.
You can tell people to stay in their houses anytime you want. That's a pretty powerful thing to have in your back pocket.
Love to get, Bill, your thoughts. And also I see Mijong Hibbets here. And as long as we're in that region, North Korea is certainly not a really important player unless they, get really nuclear. However, at some point, you've got to think that something's going to happen to allow the Koreas to get together. And that would have, I think, potential implications for China and the region, certainly. But let's finish off the conversation on China. Bill and anybody else who'd like to make a comment. Bill, you've spent a lot of time there, way more than 3 nights. And I know that was an exaggeration, Mike. Bill, what are your thoughts there, further to what you mentioned earlier?
Well, I've been watching China for 40 years. When I moved to China in the 80s, the GDP capita was $100 per year average, and what I've watched, of course, is the fastest growth in GDP capita in the history of humankind. Probably, and we don't know what happened several 100,000 years ago, but as far as we know. And what happened in there is I've got a lot of Chinese friends and business associates who are in their early 40s, and including the managing director of our company, James Liu, who I haven't seen in person since late 2019. And I watched them become middle class and upper middle class, and what that means as far as cars and homes and travel and private schools for their one child and all those sorts of things. And I guess what impressed me was that as long as those things continued to happen, that they seem to be okay with the political aspects of the CCP. And I don't talk a lot with James about anything having to do political, obviously, but that was my sense of that generation. Now, those things are slowly going away. It's the Chinese, the amount of consumer spending is the lowest it's been in 10 years. The amount of bank savings is the highest it's been in 10 years. COVID shut down a lot of business. God only knows how many small businesses it's killed. And those are small entrepreneurs, not the, Mao and those kind of guys. And I just wonder how long it's going to be before that bubble bursts, because their youth unemployment, according to the Chinese, is 20%. Of the 11 million new graduates from college this year, less than half have gotten jobs. So how long is it going to be before that bubbles up? I don't want to be negative, Michael, but I'm just wondering how long that can go. Because as long as things continue to go up in income, I know the attitude was, hey, we're doing good. But when that starts going back down, there's an awful lot of, there's 300-400 million people in that category.
And of course, among the elites who probably will have the most to say about the future of the country, these things like sending your kid to Harvard or taking a shopping trip to New York or London, these had become perks of being an up and rising capitalist country, even if they wouldn't describe themselves that way. Those are gone. There's fewer and fewer opportunities for Chinese students to come over here. It's kind of now a politically sensitive thing to wonder if your kid's going to be stuck with that around their neck, as opposed to being an enormous thing to be proud of. So, with the political shifts, I could see the anger growing. And then the other thing is, China's cities have been fed by this enormous depopulation of the rural areas, and those are the poor in China. And poor in China, there's no equation between poor in the United States and poor. There's nobody is poor in the United States as the poor are in China, and there's millions and millions of them who are still very, very much on subsistence level. That's a source of volcanic anger that can potentially explode any time. And those are the kind of black swan events that you're foolish to try to predict, but you're definitely reckless to put aside. Those can happen very quickly, and it can be a small thing. Remember, the Arab Spring was touched off when a small, cart merchant was basically mistreated by the police, and he lit himself on fire in protest. And it was about human dignity, and it erupted all over the Arab world. So, small things can lead to enormous reaction.
Feel free to raise your hand. We could probably talk about these issues for quite a while. And again, Mijong, if you'd like to talk about Korea, I'm happy to include that if you're able to chat. You mentioned about these incidents. The Tiananmen Square happened while I was on a couple-week trip to South Korea, and I remember watching it. I was in the Seoul airport watching the video of the tank and the person. It probably wasn't live, but it seemed like it was live when I was watching it. It's like, wow, China is going to now go through this revolution. That was 35 years ago. Clearly that didn't happen, but the growth continued for 35 years until now. So I think the points that you guys raise are very interesting to see what exactly might happen next.
It's definitely important to think about what did happen, though, because I think what happened is the Chinese Communist Party realized that they were on the edge of the precipice. And in many ways, the period between 89 and roughly 2016, when Xi really clamped down, there was a liberalization in China. There was more political, space for people to talk. Culturally, there was, Jack Ma, a global capitalist celebrity. You don't hear from him anymore. So there's been a ratcheting back, really. And that's important to understand, because it fed this idea in the United States among many people that if we just let them get rich, they'll eventually become democratic. And, who knows 20 years from now, but it definitely didn't happen. And they created a model that managed to keep the steam in the pot, but kept people getting more wealthy. If that's coming apart now, we're entering a new world. We don't know, exactly what's going to happen next.
It just seems like it's such a failed strategy by China. I don't understand it, other than maybe there's just some other dynamic, or their hands are tied, or it just seems obvious that this is not a winning strategy. They're being more and more isolated, and the perks and things that are lost, and the markets that are closing on them, and Russia as an ally failing. I mean, in North Korea eventually disappearing. What's left? It just doesn't seem like a good strategy.
They do tend to measure themselves against what they saw as the alternative, which was what Gorbachev did. And they study this very carefully in school. If you have a degree in political science in China, you have studied that case study a million times. And that is as far as they're concerned, that was the great mistake he made, was opening up politics before people got rich. So we're not going to make that mistake, was their thinking. Now, who knows? It hasn't fallen apart. And, to be fair, look at the reaction to the Ukraine war. Globally, China's pretty much in good company. I mean, I'm not saying morally. I think it's amoral what they've done, but in terms of getting support from foreign countries, they're as much out front as the United States. The United States has the usual suspects, basically, backing the sanctions against, and some of our allies are not very happy about it. And Saudi Arabia, for instance, who had been in lie for years, is absolutely against it and is not playing ball. So China is in many ways thinking, well, this is a good indication of the world to come. We can be the other pole. And that's what I kind of worry about. I don't really think there'll be a US-China war per se, but I think we could very easily slide into a world of black and white again, very similar to the one that existed in the 50s and 60s and 70s, where you have, people doing business with their people and other people doing business with their people. And there's always going to be a middle. The Indians are too smart to get sucked into either side, I think. But, that's another thing. You look at the Indians, they're not enthusiastic in denouncing Ukraine or, they've been very careful to continue their relations with Russia, where they get all their weaponry, and where they do a lot of trade. So it's a really interesting thing that's happening in the world if you can look at it scientifically, but it's also really scary from an emotional standpoint, because a lot of these things are kind of wildly going, turning, and the kind of role that the US once played, which was kind of balancing all these regional balances of power, putting its finger on the scale in various regions to keep things stable. We're not capable of doing that anymore, and that's starting to show.
Okay, no, that's interesting.
Yeah, I'd like to draw another analogy, if I could, gentlemen, just quickly. Look at the United States. We're according to the U.S. Department of Commerce, there's 16 separate economic regions of the United States. Whether you agree with that or not, I don't know. Our company has worked with Denny's restaurants, taking them into 18 countries. Denny's has 8 menus from Hawaii to South Carolina. We're 330 million people. We're very diverse, and I think I could be nonpartisan in saying the government's having a hard time controlling everything that goes on, right? China is much bigger, 4 times the population, very diverse country with lots of people in different places that don't like the central government. I think I think that Xi and his boys have got a lot of, we got to think about all the big problems they have. That's what I'm getting at. I'm not saying that we're better than them. I'm just saying that they're much bigger than us and have a lot of diversity, and trying to manage that country is a huge task. And never mind what else is going on. I think that alone is something we need to keep in mind as far as keeping people happy. It's going to be much more difficult for Xi than it is for our country, I believe.
When I've over the last few months, I've been giving some presentations on where opportunities are, and certainly one of them is something you guys touched on, which is India. We haven't talked about Africa yet, but when you think about the regions of either China, India, and Africa, so I've kind of mixed countries and regions, the one-child policies of China have limited the population growth for China, but that isn't the case with India and Africa. Both of them are growing considerably faster, and I think because of that and many reasons, offer some really significant business opportunities. I wonder how those dynamics are playing in, along with something else we didn't really talk about is the old CIS countries, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Lithuania, Estonia, all those, that kind of entire region. They're thriving for the most part. They have this kind of Hungary thing that's kind of hidden in the background that happened in Italy as well. And we didn't talk about your comment about nativism being driven by COVID. I'd like to learn more about that. Not to throw too much at you, but maybe let's start with the rise of India and how they've played both sides, both poles, fairly effectively so far. And then you've got Africa as a hidden gem, probably decades away, but nonetheless, it'll be an influential player, seems to be becoming more influential, maybe even in this polar dynamic that you're talking about. What in that would you like to tackle?
Well, let's go with India first. I think the Indians have been wooed and wooed and wooed by the United States, whose great dream is that in the great global game of pickup basketball, where you're choosing teams in the beginning of the game, that India comes and plays with us, right? They're not having it. They set themselves up during the Cold War as the referee, basically. of this kind of third way of the non-aligned countries. There's a very strong part of Indian geopolitical thinking that's still kind of there. They don't want to be sucked into a really hard and fast alliance with the US. If they get pushed into one, that's different. And there have been moments where there have been little clashes in the Himalayas on the border with China where you thought it might happen. And there have been some moves by China to build, for instance, they've kind of basically bankrupted Sri Lanka into giving them a naval base, for instance. And they have set up a number of, and you could see it why they do it from China's standpoint. They have a long, very vulnerable supply chain to the Middle East for their oil. So the Chinese have built naval bases in Djibouti in East Africa. They've built, they've got little islets along the way, and the Indians look at that as a way to strangle them. So there are definitely strategic concerns that are pushing India toward us, but they're not there, and I don't think they're going to go. I think they want to stay out of that big game and trade with both sides and not get stuck in that. The Africa thing that's really interesting, I think, is that they've now moved in the last decade. They've gone from being a source of raw material to a geopolitical player. There are countries there that are becoming, systemically important, and it's not the ones you'd expect. Egypt and South Africa kind of collapsed in on themselves, mostly because of governance issues. But the Nigerians, the Kenyans, to some extent, other smaller countries, Rwanda, for instance, plays way above its weight in the world. These are countries that now have, real voice in the future of the continent, but also of the world. And the population of Africa is going to be, it's going to be the world's most populous continent very soon.
Yep.
And people don't realize that, but it's growing faster than it should probably. And it's within probably 2040, 2050, it'll be larger than Asia in terms of population. That's both interesting and scary because economically they can't sustain that population right now. So there's going to be migration issues. There's going to be, civil conflict. A lot of that is going to come to a head over the next 20, 30 years if we want to look further out. But in business, there's lots of opportunity there. And the governance in Africa has improved enormously in the last 20 years. Still a rough place to do business, but it's not completely opaque the way it was 20 years ago. There are markets, there are regulators, there are, sometimes they're corrupt regulators, but there's rule of law in many of these countries now to protect your investments. And I'm sure there are many people with experience in Africa on this call who could back that up.
Yeah, I think you're right, Michael. I think Africa has been the land of potential, future potential for forever, perpetual potential. The challenge has been governments and the corruption that's in Africa. One of the things we measure in our quarterly Global View ranking of 40 countries is corruption. And even if you don't participate in the corruption, it tends to slow business down.
Yep.
And I'm reminded of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which I guess is now the Bill Gates and Melinda Gates Foundations. But they had a policy where they would not give money in Africa to governments. They would give it to NGOs directly.
Yep. And
somehow we have to get around that. But of course, the bottom line is corruption is everywhere.
Yeah.
Including here in the People's Republic of California, where I live, by the way.
Hey, I'm from New Jersey. I hear you.
Okay, well, there you go.
I see we only have a few minutes left, and one thing that we didn't touch on that would be great, at least to mention, is around on the technology side of things and how that's evolving, particularly related to global workforce. And it would seem that given the technology and COVID's reaction to it, and having a global team with players everywhere would be more and more practical than ever, which you would think would lead to more globalization, or at least some part of the definition of globalization. What's your perspective on that? And then I think we probably need to have some wrap up comments so we can finish up at top of the hour. So just a
Okay.
few left.
So it's, there's always a reaction to solutions, and they're not always the ones that you want. Zoom and Teams and all these conferencing things have, on the one hand, allowed us to speak across borders very efficiently. But they've also taken over our lives, and it's so. For instance, I control the marketing budget at Microshare. I'm a little leery of webinars right now because people are exhausted staring at screens. And here I am on a webinar. But ultimately, I think it's a good thing as long as it doesn't. If we don't ever snap back to personal contact, it's going to be disastrous, because I currently have a staff of people who 50% of whom I've never met. That would never have happened in the previous world that we lived in. It's been COVID essentially, and not because we're afraid of getting COVID or because travel restrictions make it hard now. It's just become harder to justify a meet and greet type of a trip with Zoom, and with what we now know from, we can work from home fairly efficiently. You don't have to get on an aircraft, and it is a pain in the neck to travel. I had a horror story this summer. So ultimately, I think that's what I worry about, is that global relationships are not built on screens. They're built sitting on side by side in a room or at a restaurant, or walking out in the street and learning about someone's culture from through their eyes, and being honest about your ignorance. That's what attracted me to journalism, was you were constantly ignorant. You had to. That was what you should be. You should be you should be out there just soaking up everything and not judging it as it goes in. Do that later, right? But that kind of tactile, personal touch, I hope that it is not a permanent casualty of the pandemic.
That's a really great point. I think all of us, Bill, 47, 48 years of experience, me with 35, we earned our chops because we did that, right? Traveling weeks at a time, country to country, company to company, meeting people, drinking with people, what's the value of that? It's amazing. It's significant. We've touched the world here today. I wonder if we could hopefully get both of you actually back. It would be great to talk more about this as it goes. This to me feels like something we should be doing regularly, so that we can not just share it with people who can attend, but then we'll share it more broadly, so that both on LinkedIn and also on blogs, so that people can get a flavor for some of these issues that are hard to digest in the news, right? If you watch the news, you can't really get this view. I don't know where people get it other than experts like you. So thank you so much for taking the time today. Really appreciate it. Before we end, could you explain a little bit more about Microshare and just kind of what you guys do and how we would engage, and when would we engage with Microshare?
Sure. I just put it in the chat, my email, mmoran@microshare.io. And Microshare is a smart building technology company. We use the Internet of Things to bring kind of vital signs to things we thought were inert, like buildings. And buildings actually have respiratory systems and plumbing, it's their digestive system. And, the pandemic really shined a light on this stuff. And so it's not just a cost efficiency thing, which is definitely part of the sale for Microshare. It's sustainability, it's the wellness of people inside, it's the valuation of your properties. A smart building's worth one that's not smart. That's just true in the marketplace. And in commercial real estate, we're finding our clients are desperate to differentiate themselves and to hold on and understand how their tenants are using these spaces, so they're not hit with a sudden lease loss after the 7-year lease is up. These are really important data points. And then there's this kind of secondary market in all this data as well. If you own a bunch of shopping centers and Nike launches a new shoe, how many people went into that store. S&P and Thomson Reuters will buy that.
Do you end up working with the commercial real estate industry because of that?
We have a large practice with commercial real estate, corporate real estate, who are trying to right size their portfolios with this new world. Manufacturing, we have our kind of spatial recognition software and things like asset zoning, which, so very simple use case, inside a hospital, nurses waste a lot of their time looking for wheelchairs, and it hurts patient care and it drives them crazy. We can tell you where they are on an app in a second. And not only does that help them get a wheelchair, it also helps them figure out who's dumping them all in that same corner every day. And so, you know, there's all sorts of things. These small little data things can have enormous productivity benefits, and obviously health and well-being too.
Got it. Thank you very much. Bill, did you want to make any last comments as well?
I very much enjoyed Michael's perspective, really. Thank you. Another data point for me. Greatly appreciated.
Mike, I don't know if you know, but Bill issues every 2 weeks. He's got a newsletter that he sends out, kind of a view of the world, covering about 30 or so key countries, but really kind of the whole world. Is that a fair way to explain it, Bill, in terms of giving people an idea of what's happening and what's the meaning of what's happening?
Yeah, the key is we monitor on a daily basis 30 information sources, which are mostly bipartisan. And I read 3 newsletters a day on China. That's, I don't know if that's a plus or a minus, but and then we put out we started this newsletter during COVID, and it's now in its 66th edition. It goes to 1,450 people in 20 countries. But bottom line is trying to look for trends. Trends are everything. Yeah, because our business, Michael, is taking brands into new countries, and so we're looking for trends that they're going to endure while they're in a country.
Oh, sure.
And it's becoming more and more interesting by the day to try to project.
Bill, I'm going to reach out.
Had you two met before today, or was this the first time you've really had a
first
chance?
First time.
Okay. Yeah, I believe it's the first time.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug, and congrats on the new grandkid.
Yeah.
Thank you. As soon as my daughter gives me permission, I'll send it more broadly. But thank you both. Thank you everybody who attended, and if you're watching this as a recording, thank you for participating today, and keep aware of what's going on in the world. Bill's newsletter is a key part of it, that you should be watching every 2 weeks. Bill, for your information, you know, we've been doing those Clubhouse conversations so that we could have conversations like this. I finally figured out how to do a LinkedIn audio event, and I finally was able to get through. And so you probably saw something in the last couple of days. I don't know whether you can do that one. I think it's next Thursday or something like that. But if you can or can't, I do intend to hopefully do those now as the replacement for Clubhouse, which is, you know, a little bit not really our brand. I think LinkedIn is going to be a little bit closer to the group of folks that we'd want to hang out with generally. No disparagement intended. So we'll be in touch on that. And again, Michael, thank you so much for today. Look forward to following up with you in the future. Take care, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.